Okay, everyone. Today we have the incredible pleasure of having as a guest Katica Roy. I'm going to tell you all about the incredible things she has done. Katica Roy is an award-winning gender economist, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. Former Global 500 executive, programmer, data scientist, and the CEO and founder of Pipeline, which is an award-winning SAS company recognized by Time and Fast Company. CNN, MSNBC, Bloomberg, CBS, ABC, Yahoo Finance, they all seek her sharp, unconventional economic insights. Now, Katica was the one who broke the story in her viral MSNBC byline about the 300,000 Black women that have been pushed out of the U.S. labor force in just 3 months. A data analysis amplified by Secretary Hillary Clinton, Senator Raphael Warnock, and others that sparked national coverage and policymaker attention. Her insights have appeared on the front page of the New York Times and in S&P Global, the Boston Globe, Essence, Ebony, and Forbes. A leading voice on the economics of equity, Katica is the flagship columnist for Equity Observer's Equity by Design, where she explores how inclusive economies drive growth. Her bylines span the World Economic Forum, Fortune, Fast Company, Bloomberg, Forbes, MSNBC, Harvard Business Review, reaching more than 2.9 billion impressions. She has interviewed national and global leaders, from former President Biden, former Vice President Harris, to Senators Booker and Gillibrand, spoken on over 100 stages worldwide, including South by Southwest, CES, Web Summit, and for Fortune 500 companies like Google, Cisco, and JP Morgan. She's the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee and a proud breadwinning mother of two. Katica embodies her belief that equity is not charity, it's a growth strategy. So, Katica, welcome to the Culture Advantage.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to dive right in. I mentioned we were going to talk about what a gender economist is, because I bet not everyone has heard that. Can you just tell us in plain language, what is a gender economist? What do you do in that role?
Yeah, so I'm going to explain first what folks might have seen of my work, and then I'll talk about what it is. So you mentioned
Perfect.
in the intro that my MSNBC byline, which first broke the news with my original research, that 300,000 Black women have been pushed out of the labor force in 2025. That's one example of what a gender economist does, or those forced exits had cost the U.S. economy over $37 billion in lost GDP. On the front page of the New York Times, one of the things that I talked about was the fact that in the same time period, so from February to July, Black women had lost 319,000 jobs at the same time that white men had gained 365,000 jobs, and that the cuts that have happened in 2025 have disproportionately impacted Black women. So that's an example of what your audience might have heard of what a gender economist does. There are two aspects to it. One is that a gender economist looks at the economy through the lens of intersectional gender equity, so gender plus race and ethnicity and age, but also looks at equity as not just the right thing to do, though it is, but actually as a massive economic opportunity, and quantifies that. Those exits this year, as I mentioned, of the $37 billion in lost GDP, don't just impact Black women and their families. It impacts everybody. If you care about the solvency of Social Security, if you care about any kind of programs, if you care about the growth of our economy and good paying jobs, those exits should concern you.
Yeah. Can you connect the dots for folks? Because this is complicated stuff. Between those big picture numbers, right? All the 300, more than 300,000 jobs lost to Black women, more than 65,000 jobs gained by white men. Can you connect the dots on how that impacts all those other things that you're talking about? Social Security and all the other stuff.
So Social Security specifically, in that Social Security and Medicare and other programs, we have them at the state level as well, are payroll-based programs. So in other words, the more people that have jobs and get paid via payroll, then pay into those systems. When you have people, like huge cohorts of folks losing jobs at that scale, like 300,000 Black women, um, now you're talking about 300,000 fewer people paying into the programs on which we all rely. And for Social Security specifically, we know from the latest research that Social Security is supposed to run out of money in 8 years. So if you care about Social Security or if you care about getting benefits, you should care about Black women having not only jobs, but good paying jobs. That's just one impact. I mean, you're also
Yeah.
talking about everything from rent to mortgages. So any type of company that relies on folks to have jobs, like banks, right, which rely on deposits in order to lend money to make money on those deposits. Insurers are the same thing. They need more people paying into that insurance than taking benefits out, right? Those are just two examples, but your local grocery store, your restaurants, your cars, all of those things are impacted when people lose jobs, especially at that scale.
Yeah, yeah, gosh. And help people understand, how is that not offset by the jobs that are being gained, say, by white men?
Well, it's not a one-to-one.
Mhm.
It's not like you can't just trade one for the other. What makes the impact to Black women, so specific, there's two things. I mean, one is, like, they're the only cohort that has lost that amount of jobs at scale. But the other piece of that is that Black women are both the most educated cohort in the United States labor force. So they are more likely to be underemployed. So they are the exact folks we don't want to lose out of the labor force. But the second piece is that they're actually the breadwinners in 52% of Black households with children under the age of 18. So when you're talking about the impact for our labor force and our economy, you're talking about the impact to today's labor force, but also our future labor force. Because one of the things that we know from research is that the single most important factor that determines a child's future economic standing is their parents' economic standing. And
Mhm.
so it's really important. So when you look at Black women as a cohort, right, they are the breadwinners in 52% of all Black households with children under the age of 18, which is about 9 million Black children that Black breadwinning moms support in the United States. It's about a third of all children that live in breadwinner mom households in the US. So you're talking about a huge cohort of folks that we are impacting not just today, right? So food security, housing, healthcare, et cetera, but also our future labor force.
Wow, wow. It's fascinating and scary. How if folks hear those numbers and maybe have an idea of why so many Black women have lost jobs, but don't know exactly the specifics like you do, can you walk us through, like, how those folks are exiting the job market? What is going on? What are the different factors? Are there specific industries? Just walk us through how it's happening, why it's happening.
So Uh, and there's really three pieces, just so folks understand. There's labor force participation, employment, right, like having a job, and uh unemployed. So you're looking for a job but you don't have a job. So those are like three different numbers. But in terms of folks understanding, so there are a few different factors that impacted Black women's employment in 2025. One was the federal job cuts. We know from research that Black women are 6% of the labor force in the United States. They made up, prior to the cuts in 20 federal job cuts in 2025, 12% of the federal labor force. A and there's a very good reason for that. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. And they made up 33% of the cuts. So they made up almost 3 times the amount of the cuts relative to their representation in the federal labor force. That's the first reason. I'll talk about why they have such a high employment in the federal labor force in a minute, but that's the first
Yeah.
reason. The second reason is the pullback of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So both funding, that's one, but also just those positions in general. And I'm not saying that because Black women have those, like, it's not because they were employed, like, they might be employed in the DEI position, but in actual fact, we know that because Black women sit at the intersection of race and gender, they tend to be most likely to be impacted by inequity. And so when diversity, equity, and inclusion programs go away, they are also most impacted. They're not the ones
Mm,
who benefit the most from the programs, but they're the ones that are most impacted when they go away. That's the second.
mm.
The
Who
third,
does benefit the most,
white
Katica?
women. White
Yeah.
women benefit the most from DEI programs. The third reason is artificial intelligence and tech. So we know
Mm,
that Black women their jobs are one of the highest risks to being automated. A lot of that has to do with occupational segregation, kind of tying back to what I talked about Black women being underemployed, not through any fault of their own. And so their job risk of automation is about 21% of their jobs, the jobs that Black women hold. Yet they represent only 3% of the tech labor force.
mm,
So they're not actually in the rooms where the decisions are being made about what jobs we automate, et cetera. There are, so you'll probably ask me about solutions. So I'll just stop there, hold that answer for a second. And then the last piece is that and we saw this during the pandemic, we've seen it other times as well, but we in the United States don't use what's called gender mainstreaming or gender budgeting. So Canada uses it, Finland uses it, a lot of European countries use it, Iceland uses it, which is
mm,
this idea of we assume that public policy is gender neutral. It isn't, it's gender ignorant.
mhm.
And so
Okay.
we make, and I'll give you a concrete example. We make decisions about policy, assuming that it's just going to impact everyone the same way. And the data shows that that's not in actual fact true. So one example of that is during the pandemic, we sent out stimulus to households. And the way that that stimulus was calculated was you got a certain amount per adult and you got a certain amount per child. So if you were a married couple with 2 children, you got more money than if you were a breadwinner mom with 2 children. And we know from, for instance, my research that breadwinner moms as an entire cohort, and I'll talk about what this means specifically for Black breadwinner moms as a cohort have the largest gender pay gap of any women in the labor force. It's
Mm,
66 cents on the dollar.
wow.
Of any cohort. Now, when you look at that data through an intersectional gender lens, so as a gender economist, right, gender plus race and ethnicity, Black breadwinner moms have the largest gender pay gap of any women in the labor force. It's
Mm,
44 cents on the dollar. If we had
oh my
gender,
gosh.
yes, if they earn about on average $15,000 per year per child. We're
Mm,
talking about just, I mean, it's like not at all enough. So when that funding went out, it didn't take any of that into account that uh like if you're looking at breadwinner moms, they're underpaid. They're less likely to have savings. They were more likely to be in positions that were impacted by the pandemic, right? We know that women lost 57.5% of all jobs during the pandemic. So
mm,
now I have less money coming in from the stimulus because it's not taking into account that um that I actually had less money coming in before. And by the way, the last thing I'll say is this. If you think this doesn't impact you, you are wrong. If you are an
mm,
American taxpayer, you are funding the pay gap. You subsidize companies that underpay their employees through social welfare programs.
Can you say that again and again in a couple different ways so people
Well,
understand
so
it?
just one example of how inequity impacts all of us is that if you are an American taxpayer, right, you pay either taxes as your individual income, you pay it on your capital gains, you pay it as a corporation, however you pay taxes into the federal government, you subsidize the gender pay gap. Because we know that the sectors that historically and occupations that historically have the largest gender pay gap, and therefore people rely on social welfare programs to make up the difference. Like we as American taxpayers are subsidizing that
Mm. And why is it set up like that?
because we don't because because we assume, so this is the last point of like, why did Black women lose jobs? Those four reasons that I laid out. The last one was gender
Uh-huh.
mainstreaming, gender budgeting, right? This idea that we assume that public policy is gender neutral. And when I say gender, just so people know, I mean intersectional gender equity, gender plus race and ethnicity and age, right? So it's 120 intersections of data. And we know that public policy is not gender neutral, it's gender ignorant. And we all foot the bill for that ignorance. Every single
Mm.
American taxpayer.
Yeah, gosh. I bet there's so few people that kind of get that. So I think that'll be really interesting for people to hear. Just one quick point of clarification, or maybe two. One is just when you say breadwinner, mom, you
What
mean
is that?
exactly? Yeah.
So that is mom, like with one or more children under the age of 18, who earns 51% or more of the family's income.
Okay. Great. And then you talked about coming back to why are Black women so overrepresented
Or,
in federal government
yes.
agencies,
And I wouldn't say overrepresented. I would say they have a high concentration. Just
higher
because to me, when
concentration.
people say
Yep.
overrepresentation, it somehow sounds like it's their fault, and it's not their fault. So the reason why Black women historically have had, uh, or not historically, but sort of in recent history, have had a high level of employment in the federal government is because it was a pathway to the middle class. So when we talk about pay, the federal government historically had far more equitable pay and also equity of opportunity. So you're talking about jobs that are salaried, they're not hourly. They have health benefits and retirement benefits and sick leave and vacation, and they have the opportunity to progress up. So that's why Black women, their representation in the federal government, they represent 12%, or historically before the cuts this year, 12% of the federal labor force, which is about double of their share of the labor force overall, because they had equity of opportunity, which they haven't had in the corporate world, not at scale.
Hmm. Yeah.
And we know,
Yeah.
for instance, like all the cuts in the federal government were made to organizations, uh, to departments, agencies where Black women had a high share of the labor force. Whether that was by design, I can't tell you, but I can tell
Right.
you that where those cuts were made
Yep.
was, yeah.
Yeah. And so help us understand too, like, let's say you are a leader at a medium sized organization or large organization, not federal government agency. How is this kind of thing impacting you at work, your organization, or um, the culture of your organization? Obviously, we talk a lot about culture, cultures of inclusion, exclusion, equity or not, safety or not. We talk a lot about that on the podcast. How are these kinds of trends that you're seeing impacting organizations?
Well, I think that one of the things that we know from, so let me just take a step back. The oftentimes folks equate gender equity with women's rights. They make those a synonym, and they are not. So, gender equity is men, women, non-binary. It's not just for women. And I'm talking about all women, uh, And so one of the things that we know from the research is that gender inequity doesn't just impact uh, women; it impacts men. And I'll talk about that specifically. And that's not only like the economic pieces that I was talking about in terms of things like solvency of Social Security or growing the United States economy, so we have more jobs and good paying jobs, et cetera. One of the things that we know from research is that one of the primary ways that, and when you're talking about culture of inclusion and belonging, is that gender inequity impacts men is what is typically referred to as the man box. This sort of strict uh, rules that men have to live by in our society, which get stricter when inclusion and belonging go away. This
Mm.
is where when people look at diversity, equity, and inclusion as binary, in other words, you're either for it or you're against it, that's an incorrect way to look at it. It is a continuum. So we know from the research that one of the primary ways, and there's others, but one of the primary ways that gender inequity impacts men is mental health. So men are account for 79% of all suicides in the United States. They are 4 times more likely to die from suicide. And it's not that women don't have mental health issues, but they are more likely to actually access mental health. So, like therapists, et cetera. And men are not because they're not supposed to. And we teach that one of the primary ways that we uh, teach boys like to man up, if you will, is through sports. Right. So this culture of youth sports, there's a lot, I have an elite athlete, a girl who's an elite athlete. We talked a lot about the benefit of athletics and sports to our girls. We don't talk about the negative impact it has on our boys. And if we change that culture, how we could actually fundamentally shift that man box, we could break the man box, right? We could actually shift those strict guidelines for men and boys, because men and boys, and they both watch this in professional sports, but they also experience it in youth sports. And I have a son, he's 18. So I also saw him go through this and ran interference for it. But is this idea of like, we tell our boys not to cry. We tell them to man up. And so then they end up stuffing all that stuff. And one of the things that we know from the research is that 48% of working dads would actually like to stay home with their kids. And we experienced this because my husband was a stay at home father for 15 years. And the reason that and they were like, when he started, so I live in Colorado, I think our population is 6 million or something like that. Uh, and when he started as a stay at home dad, there were just over 26,000 stay at home dads in the entire state of Colorado.
Wow.
So the reason that men don't do this, even though they want to, or the same thing happens with paternity leave. Talk about culture of inclusion. We can have paternity leave, but what the research shows is men don't take it. And this idea is identity and isolation. Who will I be and who will I connect with? And
Mm.
that's all about culture and belonging.
For
And
sure.
so
For sure.
like we are leaving our boys behind as a society. That doesn't mean we should not focus on what's happening for women and girls and non-binary folks, but we are leaving our boys behind. We see that in education attainment. We see this in mental health. That should also be something that we invest in. This is where we get it wrong when we say, like, you're either for gender equity or you're against it, or gender equity is rah rah women and it's women's rights. It's none of those things. The data does
Mm.
not support that.
That is fascinating. I hadn't heard that term man box before, but it makes so much sense. I mean, just from my own experiences and like the experiences of raising 3 boys in a small town in Maryland, where I've seen them go, almost you can almost like visualize it, going from this world of open possibilities to, as they interact with other kids and adults, they're that box like closing in on them, and like you said, having to run interference to try to keep it open, but like swimming upstream.
Yeah.
um well,
Yeah.
what Another thing I think about when I hear some of this stuff that you're talking about is all the kind of invisible labor that women and especially Black women do at organizations, and what the cost might be for these trends that you're seeing in terms of that. Like,
I mean, I'll just give you one example, and then I want to talk about the rest of it. But like when I was in my MBA class, at my executive MBA, the first group project we had, I was asked to take notes, and only 25% of my MBA class was women. And I was like, this is the first and last time I will ever take notes. And they're like, why? I'm like, because women always get asked to do this. And you are just as capable of taking notes as I am. So this is the first and last time I will ever take
yeah,
notes in my entire MBA class.
yeah.
Right?
When men don't see that stuff. Like I'll often tell men about that, and they'll say, no, it's just that my handwriting's bad. And you're like, yeah,
My
that's what every
handwriting is not
man
any
says.
better. And I think that also goes to so the other piece of so let me just talk to that, and then I'll go back and answer your question. But that also goes it goes back to the fact that we assume, just as one example, we assume that putting more women in leadership roles will automatically solve inclusion. It won't. Because one of the things that we know from research is that 9 out of 10 of us, so 90% of us, have bias, have gender bias. So your gender determines how likely you are to uh, experience bias, but not how likely you are to have it. Those are two very
Uh,
different distinctions. It's why
uh-huh.
having more female venture capital partners is not going to automatically mean we have more funded female founders. Uh, that doesn't actually. Now, we should want more female venture capital partners because they're better asset managers and they
Right.
have, on average, have better returns for their LPs, right? They're investors,
Yeah.
but it's not the reason to have that. So, and just as one example, but to go back to
Yeah.
your question, one of the things, and we did this at Pipeline, we have processed, 1 million performance reviews, right? Over 1 million performance reviews. And we created was trained on the Pipeline platform was trained on data sets from over 6,000 companies in 32 countries, over 1 billion data points. And what we found was two things. When you're talking about what that inclusion, I think now it's an opportunity to rebuild it in a more inclusive, with inclusion and equity at the core. So rather than inequitable by default, equity by design. And what I mean by that is two things. In the Pipeline platform, there's really there's 5 different engines, but two of them are, one of them is germane to what you were talking about. One is performance, and the other is potential. And one of the things that we saw in uh, running performance reviews through our platform is that about a third of all performance reviews contain bias. And 4% of the time, that actually leads to women receiving lower performance ratings for the same performance.
Wow.
And that
4%, you said.
4%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually modeled out over an employee life cycle means that it takes, and this is all women, not just Black women, and I'll talk about what it means for Black women because the platform is intersectional. Modeled out, it means that it takes women, all women, twice as long to be promoted into the same role. So when you're
Wow.
talking about invisible labor, that's
Mm.
some of what, and we would look for that. One of the things that the platform looked for was rewarding employees for invisible labor or non-promotable tasks, right? Gender
Uh,
task, and highlighting it for them. And the second is when you receive a lower performance rating for similar performance, then in most large corporations, they have potential ratings. That's either typically a 4 box or a 9 box. And one of those axes, like one of those sides of that grid, is your performance rating. The other is your potential rating. You can't be in the top right box, that is a high potential or whatever we want to call it today, if you don't have a top performance rating, which means that you won't get the visible tasks, the visible projects, the sponsorship to actually even have the opportunity to get promoted to the next level. And this is why we see 6% of the labor force is Black women, and they make up 0.4% of Fortune 500 CEOs. So
Wow.
we now have the opportunity with what's happening to rebuild with equity at its core, right? And the
Mhm.
other benefit then for men is we can break the man box. It shouldn't just be women or Black women that are actually, um, being turned to for emotional support, right? It should also
Yeah.
be men. One of the things I'll just say, and I had said, I'll talk about what it means for Black women. One of the things that we found is like from that very first promotion, like the promotion rate, why we looked at why we look at our data through an intersectional gender lens, is that men are promoted at a rate of 21% greater than women, right? So, and when you look at that through an intersectional gender lens, so gender plus race and ethnicity, for Black women, that gap doubles, right? So,
Wow.
that's why that intersectional gender lens matters, because Black women sit at that intersection of gender and race. And so you have to take that into account.
Yeah. You are so full of information and you drop these little nuggets that I want to ask so many follow-up questions about. You dropped in there that we have this opportunity to rebuild with equity at the core or breaking the man box. Are you hopeful about that? How does one do that? How would an organization do that? Why is this a good opportunity?
So, the pipeline platform, just based on my research, I'll talk about this and why you should care about it, not just as the social issue, the right thing to do. Started with research. So we did research across initially, and then we expanded. We did research across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. We later expanded it to 6,032. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in intersectional gender equity, so gender plus race and ethnicity and age, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue. So this is not just the right thing to do. It's actually, as a CEO, your number one job is to maximize shareholder value. This is one of the key levers that you do that. And since we're recording this podcast in 2025 during a time of economic uncertainty, we
Mhm.
also know from the research that companies that put equity at the core of their strategy, not just their human capital strategy, but their business strategy. So, cash management, vendor management, everything you're doing, actually, in an economic during economically, like a volatile economic environment, they actually have a 50 percentage point swing on their stock price.
50?
50 percentage. Yeah. So
Wow.
they actually come out better in in a volatile economic environment. By the way, uh, as a recent example, this also happens if companies are struggling, regardless of the economy. This is also when they should double down on equity. And I'll give you an example of that. That folks may have heard about, but may not have heard the backstory to it. So there was the Target fast, right? So in
Mhm.
January, Target pulled back on all of its, or a lot of its diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was a very large boycott that was organized called the Target fast. And in by the time I wrote about it, Target had lost a third of its market cap. That is an existential crisis.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is an existential crisis, and a huge amount of their foot traffic, and of course, their CEO was replaced. Here's what preceded Target's decision in January 2025 and why they should have actually doubled down on equity. they were already struggling financially, in terms of growth and their financial metrics, their business metrics, prior to January 2020.
Mm,
So they actually did the exact opposite
the wrong thing.
of
Yeah.
what they should have done, and we now
Mhm.
see the result of that.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That's so fascinating. I love these specifics. You often hear people talking about, what they call the business case for diversity and equity and inclusion, but getting this fine grained is so important and so interesting. Um, Another thing I wanted to follow up on is you were talking about finding bias in performance reviews. And I wondered if people would be curious, what does that look like? How do you find the bias in performance reviews? Because we recently had a whole episode talking about bias. So I think that'd be interesting for people.
So, uh, I started Pipeline 8 years ago, before really, uh, over 8 years ago, um, on Equal Pay Day in 2017, which I think was April 4th, 2017. And, and, um, this was before people really understood artificial intelligence. So it is a software platform engineered with artificial intelligence. And what we did was process a lot of data. We also had access to a lot of research, but looking at what are the different ways that bias shows up. We know some of the things, right? We know that by the way, there's no mom that doesn't work. We never said working dads, but whatever. It's that moms that participate
Yeah.
in the paid labor force
Yeah.
are more likely to be mommy tracked. That is, they're more likely to have the bias that they experience is that they're less committed to, because they are moms. We know that for every child they have their pay goes down, and then the inverse happens for dads. And
Mm,
in fact, what we also know is from the research that the most productive employees over the course of their career are moms, are moms participating in the paid labor force. So if you want to actually invest in any employee, that's who you should invest in that cohort of employees.
mhm.
But we knew a lot of the research in terms of what to look for in the data. And then in the performance review, so now that people know what ChatGPT and generative AI is, back then they didn't. But that's what
Right.
Pipeline does. So in performance reviews, it actually uh, codes the bias and codes the level of bias, and then uses generative AI to actually recommend replacement language in those performance
Huh.
reviews. And it's all done before the performance review is actually finalized.
That's
So
cool.
you're looking at that performance review, and then for the ratings themselves, we're looking across, uh, um, a set of performance reviews so that we can actually have across that set what would be the equitable performance rating for this performance.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
And here's the thing
Um,
that's interesting, by the way. And you said you had
yeah.
so people, the World Economic Forum. I think the current time that in their 2025 global gender gap report, it's like 132, 135 years until we reach gender equity, and it's, I think, 165 years in the workplace. Those are generally accurate. I don't have those quite off the top of my head, but that's about what they are. Here's what's so
Wow.
interesting with artificial intelligence. We could actually, using artificial intelligence, we could eradicate bias in the workforce in 10 years using artificial intelligence. Like
Whoa.
yeah, it is within our grasp to
Wow.
have and it would lead to massive economic opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. So many questions. Um uh it's not usually how you hear about bias and AI in the same sentence,
Yeah, you
right?
hear the
That
flip side of
you
it.
you hear the flip
Yeah.
side. So like Tell me about that flip. Like, tell me about bias in AI normally in the way we hear about it and how that plays out, and then how you've managed to flip it so that it could do that work of eradicating bias.
So I'll start with the first is like what people talk about is bias in AI, which uh something that we've paid attention to obviously for a long time. I think it's gotten uh more coverage in the especially in 2025, but ever since like ChatGPT and other generative AI models were released. So there's really two pieces to bias in AI. I wrote about some of this for Katie Couric Media as well as Design Observer, and I've written about it for other outlets as well, like Fast Company, etc., World Economic Forum. So there's two pieces of that in terms of bias in AI. One is the data that's actually put into the systems, and the second is the algorithms themselves, right? So
Hmm.
the data uh, often has bias in it, right? We saw this, for instance, I mean, probably the one that your listeners may be most aware of is the Amazon hiring app, where they
Hmm.
tried to where they did create artificial intelligence to screen out resumes, and because Amazon hires mostly men, it downgraded women. So that's an
Hmm.
example of the bias in the data. We also saw this with the original launch of the Apple Card underwritten by Goldman Sachs, where you could be a woman with the exact same assets as a man and have a lower access to credit, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's that. The second is how we actually create the algorithms themselves. So if we understand the bias that may be in the data, how we actually create a supervised learning system, because the algorithms need to process a lot of data to learn, how we create those algorithms and then continue to train them so that they're not hardwiring bias into the algorithm. Those are the two
Mm.
pieces. And we are seeing that happen at scale. I mean, LinkedIn is one example. There's been numerous studies that have happened uh, this year, well, this year and specifically around the bias toward women on LinkedIn. And that's not just uh, about being heard, though that is a key part of it, but it's also about getting customers and
Mm.
thought leadership and who's recognized as a thought leader. So we've seen that and LinkedIn is not the only example, but we see that, and we see that replicated across social media in general, right? We're seeing that on Facebook and Instagram, et cetera. And and now what's happening with the algorithms that drive social media is outrage sells. And
Hmm.
we're seeing it replicate that at scale. And we see that particularly happening for women. So female candidates, for instance, experience something like 10 times the harassment that male
Mm.
elected official, folks running for office. That's just one example, but there are numerous. We've seen a downgrading. I think it was on Instagram, might have been on Facebook, but of female owned businesses uh, having their posts shared out, right? The algorithm, of course, we're seeing this on LinkedIn too. And that's actually happening at a time when in the United States, women own 42% of all companies, right? And now we have this, Black women being pushed out of the labor force doesn't mean they're not working. I mean, maybe some of them, but that's highly unlikely. Where they're most likely going is into entrepreneurship. Well, if the algorithms are downgrading them because of gender and race, now
Yeah.
they can't make a living uh, as an entrepreneur, right?
Hmm.
So that's just one example. And we can talk about how you make AI equitable, but that impacts everyone. I mean, we
Yeah.
want entrepreneurs to make money because when they make money, they employ more people, they can pay people more, we increase our tax base. Like those are all really good things that we actually want entrepreneurs to succeed at. Just even set aside the innovation piece, right?
Right. Right. Wow. Now, given that people know about the bias that is in a lot of the AIs, like, are you seeing companies try to do something about that, either in the way they adjust the algorithm or the inputs? Or is it still kind of a new emerging idea that you could have a more equitable AI?
It's not an emerging idea. Y I think what's interesting is that some of it is about political will or just, leadership will in general. We've seen other I wrote about this for the World Economic Forum. We've seen other countries like UAE or Iceland are two examples, and not the only ones, but who have really in the tech space, so artificial intelligence, et cetera, have committed to equity in tech,
Mm,
artificial intelligence being one of those aspects. Uh, Norway and Finland have also done. I mean, there's a lot of them, but those are just four examples. And
yeah.
it's been met with the commitment plus the leadership or political will, and because of that, they've made huge strides in equity. I mean, this is where it's not. It's really about commitment, not about possibility.
Wow. That's fascinating. Is there, what can regular people do?
I think one of the most important things we can do is stand up and speak out.
Mm,
I think holding power to account and doing it as a collective is really important. It does do more than you think it does.
uh-huh,
It really
uh-huh,
does. It does have a bigger impact than you overall. I know there are some initiatives around more equitable AI that have been announced, some big funds. I know that there are some companies that are definitely committed to it. I would not diminish the power of the people to stand up
uh-huh,
and speak out. I think that it feels sometimes like it's not making a difference. It does make a difference. And if
yeah.
you do it as a collective as well, um, you can have a ripple effect. And I will just give you two examples just from my own, and I'm sure there's others that your listeners have. But one obviously is the byline that I wrote for MSNBC, which broke that news. There was a lot of conversation already happening within the Black community and Black women about that, but they didn't have the
Uh-huh,
numbers until I published my article about that, and that took off like wildfire. I mean, it ended up in the Boston Globe and S&P Global and on the front page of the New York Times, and I was on a bunch of television shows, and there's been more articles than I can count that have cited it, and job fairs that have happened, and all sorts of things that have happened because of it, and I'm sure there'll be even more. So that was
uh-huh.
one, right? That
Yeah,
was
that's huge.
that was one thing where I was like, "This is a big deal. We need to be talking about this." And you don't really know when you publish a byline. I mean, I published, over 200 of them, I think, at this point. You don't really know which one is going to take or when it's going to take. And that one, a few days later, I was like, oh, okay. So clearly this hit a nerve. That's one. The second example I would give you is um, and this is a little bit tied to my personal story, but I think it does make a difference. So in 2016, I, after or right before Thanksgiving, my children's school, they were in elementary school at the time, was tagged with hate graffiti. And
Mm,
my children's school, their elementary school had a newcomer program that supported immigrant and refugee children and their families uh coming to the United States. And the reason why is because my sisters were newcomer kids, right? So I am the
uh-huh,
daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. My father escaped from Hungary with my three eldest sisters. They walked across a minefield, arrived to a refugee camp in Austria. Less than 2 months into their stay in the refugee camp, President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the United States on Christmas Day, 1956, and they were on that plane. By the way, that's also the first
21 people, you said?
21. And so you think about, as a parent, you're a parent watching your children, you know, y- you just imagine as a parent what it felt like to go from running, risking your child's life for freedom to watching them climb the stairs of Air Force One. And by the way, that was the first time my family was on the front page of the New York Times. The second time was in August. And so when this happened, I thought, okay, well, there's got to be something I can do to help, right? I had my daughter at the time was in kindergarten. I never again wanted to have a conversation with her that was like, I had to tell her there's going to be more police, there's going to be more public safety. And she'd already been through drills, right? The lockdown. So I was like, if your teacher asks you to come inside immediately or get in the closet, you got to do it. And I never wanted to have that conversation with her again. And
Uh-uh.
so I thought there's got to be something we can do. So I um helped to organize this coalition. Everyone from the White House down to the local school safety around keeping our kids
Wow.
safe, because a very specific segment of kids were being targeted, right?
Mm.
And so I received a letter from President Obama thanking me for standing up and speaking out. And one of the
Wow.
things that he said in that letter, this is why when you say, like, I don't know if it makes a difference, it makes a difference, is that,
Uh-huh.
and I'm paraphrasing what he wrote to me, but one of the things he said in that letter is essentially that inclusion is not a straight line. It is not a given. It relies on people like us to stand up and speak out and fight for it, and
Yeah.
that you can make a difference. And that's, my family story is why I do what I do. But this was just like a mom in a neighborhood in Denver who was like, I don't ever want to have this conversation with my daughter again. I got to figure out what I can do to fix this.
Oh my gosh, that's a great story. That's wild. Yeah, I have kids in these different schools throughout the years, and there are all kinds of things that happen related to hate or just really obvious bias um, or things that are more like subtle exclusions that happen just again and again and again and again. And I'm because of what I do for a living, that my kids are like my informants. They'll come home and tell me like,
Yeah.
you won't believe what happened here. You won't believe what happened today. And it's one of those things that people think they don't see it very much because kids don't often talk about it or report it. And because adults, especially with young kids, think they don't engage with those things, they don't understand them. It flies under the radar a lot, and it's just unfortunately creating cultures where people are being excluded day in and day out. And it's not the isolated incidents of hate, it's like the
Yeah.
everyday
Death by a
stuff.
thousand paper cuts. Well, and
Mhm.
also I would add, is that it's not like people get to the workforce, right? And then bias magically shows up. Right? These are
Mhm.
learned behaviors that start in school.
Yeah,
And
and
you can
before, I mean,
like,
you're
I taught my kids to recognize bias and to stand up against it, and not to internalize it. That's a very conscious effort, though. Like, you have to really teach your kids, like, you know, um, that it happens, that it's not about them and what they can do about it.
yeah. And I think the research is pretty clear that especially white parents do not wanna do that. They do not wanna talk about race with their kids at
Well,
all.
even gender, though. I mean, my daughter, like, I would say, yes, race, absolutely. But gender plus race and ethnicity, I mean, that matters, right? So,
Mhm.
um, you know, white girls also experience, girls
Yeah.
experience gender bias. And if you're a girl of color, right, if you're a Latina or you're Black, uh, etc., you will experience more bias and different kinds of bias.
I'm curious to hear also a little bit more about how you think about solutions, like individual people standing up, yes, and like what's your vision for a future with more gender equity, with less bias? Like, tell me about that world. What does it look like, and how do we get there?
I think about equity not as the right thing to do. Obviously, I believe that to be true, but I don't think about it in those terms. I think about it as a massive economic opportunity. So when I think about the narrative that we talk about these things, right? So there's been conversations this year, in addition to my research, there was some other research that was released around moms leaving the labor force. And uh, the issue is that often, and this happened during the pandemic as well, is that we tend to describe why that's happening in ways that are gender biased. I'll give you an example. When people hear that moms are leaving the labor force, there's, and we heard about this during the pandemic too, there's often an assumption that moms can choose not to work. And that's not true in the majority of US households with children under the age of 18. In 71% of US households with children under the age of 18, mom contributes to the economic well-being. And in 40% of US households with children under the age of 18, mom is the breadwinner, right? There's 16 million breadwinner
Mhm.
moms. They support 28 million children. So it should alarm us that when we look at that data, whether it was during the pandemic or now, that we're not going, what is going on? Because we have this bias. It's called the myth of secondary income, which is that mom thinks it's just for purses and shoes. It's not for things like housing and healthcare and food and, what have you. Yeah. So we need to change the narrative when we're talking about gender equity. One of the ways is that the inherent bias that exists in how we describe, and then we talk about, oh, well, it's because of the cost of childcare or it's return to office. When you look just at the pandemic, one of the things that we know is that it's for a very small percentage of women, mothers who were in the paid labor force, left because of the cost of childcare, because schools were shut. The majority of women who were impacted, it was two reasons. One, the majority of sectors that were impacted during the pandemic were female-dominated sectors. That was the first reason. And the second was inequity in the labor force, right? That's just like, so when you have an incorrect narrative, you then look for incorrect solutions, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So that the first thing is I would like to see us change the narrative around why this is
Yep.
happening. And I would like us to have every single conversation. We should be talking about the economic cost to everyone, right? We should
Yeah.
talk about this, not just like, oh, now moms get to stay home with their kids, but like we should talk about the economic cost to everyone. We should be talking about what's happening with men and boys. We should stop talking about gender equity as a synonym for women's rights. Men and boys are impacted. 58% of all college graduates are women. That means that only 42% of men are college graduates. That is not good for our economy either. It's great that women are making strides, but we should be concerned about the downward trend of men. And that starts in elementary school because our schools are not designed for boys. And I speak as someone who has an 18-year-old son who has experienced this first. So we have to stop talking about this as like and the other part of that gender conversation when we equate that is we look at it as a zero-sum game. If women
Uh-huh.
win, men lose. And so we have to stop doing that. The second is, like,
Yep.
it is solvable. We keep on talking about equity as like it's this ethereal, hard thing to quantify or to fix. That's not true. It is just not true. We had the
Yeah.
solutions in place, as I mentioned, where we could reach equity in 10 years, which is a benefit for everyone. In the United States, that's a $3.1 trillion opportunity. Globally, it's over $13 trillion. It's a huge, massive opportunity for us to fix. And so we really should be talking about it. And by the way, we should have a sense of urgency about it because the birth rate is dropping, not just in the
Mm.
United States, but globally, which means that if you don't have enough women in participating in the labor force, you're not going to have enough people to actually continue to grow your economy. So we got to change the way we talk about this stuff. Like we got to start looking at this data through gender plus race and ethnicity and age. We need to start talking about it as an economic opportunity, and we need to stop sidelining this stuff to like, oh, that's a women's issue.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That 10 minutes was so amazing. I'm gonna clip that. And it's just so many good ideas. And it I mean, how do you stay sane looking at all that being so solvable and yet we're not doing it? That's so frustrating. It feels like so many of the issues that are plaguing us right now are that way. They're so solvable if we could really use the data, really understand what's happening, have solutions that make sense to fit the problems, and then do it.
Well, we have to keep talking about it because it won't get better if we don't keep talking about it. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I do the work that I do, because the more people are talking about it, the more those solutions will come into play and the more that they'll actually be solutions. One of the things that I've seen pop up lately uh, are solutions where I'd say they're and I didn't coin this term. I first heard it from Arlen Hamilton, but she's like, and I think she talked about it in her book. It's like I didn't come for the crumbs, I came for the cake. So a
Mhm.
lot of our equity solutions are like crumbs, not cake. Like we're not
Yeah.
actually shifting economic power. We're not actually, and when we saw this obviously in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd, like a lot of the solutions, like for instance, just in venture capital, were like crumbs. They weren't cake.
Yeah.
And so we
Yep.
have to think about those things differently.
Yeah, for sure. But I know I've heard you mention that you've had to fight a couple times for your own equity.
Yep.
Do you have advice for women? Like, until we solve this on a big, global scale, do you have advice for women what in terms of what they can do to make sure that equity is happening for them?
Okay. Well, let me talk about that and then I'll tell my story. As a woman, one of the things we know if you're a woman or you're a woman of color in particular, uh, we know from the research that if you speak up for equity, and we've seen this in the EEOC, reflected in the EEOC data, you are more likely to uh, receive retribution, right?
Uh,
So I'd be careful. I mean, I know that's not what people want to hear, but
that's real.
yeah, you strategically, it would be better. Strategically, it would be better if you can find a man to help advocate for you, or another, or you could use like some sort of amplification technique, which is what women did in the Obama White House. So there's power in numbers. So I share that because I think so this goes back to, and then I'll tell my story, but this goes back to the um, fixing the narrative. So we fix the solution and we have the right solution. So historically, we've focused on fixing women, not fixing the system that undervalues them. So we say, well, women only apply for jobs if they have 100% of the qualifications, and men apply when they have 60%. Well, what we don't tell women is that the people sitting on the other side of the desk that are deciding whether or not you're qualified are actually using that same criteria, right? Or women don't negotiate as often. Well, actually, the research shows that women negotiate as often as men. They just don't win as often, and they have a negative perception of them because who does she think she is to advocate for herself? So it's really important that we tell the whole story and stop trying to fix it. My personal story was so I'm a breadwinner mom who fought to be paid equitably twice and won. I studied women's. I have 3 degrees, but undergraduate, I part of what I studied was women's rights and women's issues, and um, and I got to the workforce, and I was like, I don't think this really applies anymore. Like, I think that was kind of like a 1960s kind of thing. Like, I don't really think like I don't whatever. And I was like, I don't I don't think my gender is gonna have anything to do with any success I have. And so fast forward quite a few years. And when I returned from maternity leave with my daughter, I had a team that I was managing. And my boss had been optimized when I was on maternity, which is basically a fancy word for fired. So I came back, and a day after I returned from maternity leave, I was asked to take on a second team, and then 2 weeks later, I was asked to take on a third team. So now I had 3 teams that I was managing, which is great, right? Super happy, breadwinner mom, family of 4, awesome. Happy to do it, like, this is great. My male colleague was 1 pay grade higher than I was. He took on 1 additional team and also received additional compensation for that new team. And so I went to my manager and the HR business partner, and I was like, "Awesome. This is like super happy. How do you want to make me whole on my compensation?" And it was like 2 months of going back and forth. I was like, "I don't think they're going to do. I think they're just going to think that I'm going to give up." And so my first job out of college was as a litigation paralegal for one of the top law firms, because I was thinking about being a lawyer. And I was like, there's got to be something that makes this illegal. And so I found the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which is the first piece of legislation that President Obama signed into law. And what it did was change the statute of limitations for equal pay from when the decision was made to every time you receive inequitable pay, that statute of limitation starts over because you might not know for a really long time
Right.
that and then you have no restitution, no redress for fixing that problem. So I called the HR business partner and I was like, this is a Lilly Ledbetter issue. Every time you pay me, the statute of limitation starts over. What do you want to do about it? And then I just shut up. And then so within a month, they increased my level, increased my pay, and gave me back pay for the whole time that I had been doing that job. Um, yeah, and so, certainly it was a story of success, but it also got me thinking, like, why did I have to research my rights in order to be treated fairly? If
Right.
we really have a system, and I just happen to have enough legal training to know what to look for, right? And so y- I thought, well, if we have a system whereby you, as someone who is experiencing inequity, has to speak up, that's not an equitable system. Because by definition, if you are experiencing inequity, you don't have power. Because why would you do that to yourself, right?
Right.
And
Yep.
so, like, just as an example, we don't have a true equal pay law in the United States, right? The Equal Pay Act was signed into law in 1963 by President Kennedy. But it still relies on you as a woman, to speak up, is one example, for equal pay, versus countries like Iceland, where companies have to prove that they're actually paying their employees equitably and then fix it. That's
Mm.
true equitable
Uh,
pay. So
that sounds good.
it's not that you can't, but and then I had a similar situation the second time, where I just, was like, I've done the research. It was, that one was a little different. It was, in a job offer situation, where I had, been committed by my hiring manager to a certain pay. Human resources, who was handling the offer letter, decided that was too much money, even though it was equitable and it was market based. I'd done all the research, and gave me an offer that I think I can't it was a lot less. It was I don't remember what it was, but it was a lot less. And I was like I just went to my manager and I was like, "I wanna work for you," or the hiring manager, and I was like, "I wanna work for you, I'm not working for that. It's not fair. So, it's up to you. Like, either we do what we agreed or I'll just go find another job."
And that worked.
It did work.
Yeah,
But I will
that's
say,
good.
like, for me also, in that situation, and I think this is I mean, this is like a totally different issue, but if you think about hiring and talent as a market and you are a product in that market, I also knew my differentiated value and that it would have been very difficult for the hiring manager to go to somebody else to do the job that I was being that it wasn't like they could just so I knew that in that situation I had power to walk away. By the way, it was scary, right? Like,
I'm
I was my
sure,
own
yeah.
mom. It was not without fear, but I thought, "Well, I'll kick myself if I don't do this. I'll resent them
Yeah,
every time I'm paid." And
yeah.
and then and I will say, like, if you do the math, I can't remember exactly what the difference in pay was, but let's say it was $50,000 just for argument's sake. Now, if you work for a corporation and you, have it's not just the $50,000, right? It is if you have any 401k contributions, right? You're talking about substantively less money, right? Because your percentage of your 401k is based off your salary, right? So you're talking about retirement impacts. You're talking about, uh so direct like, you're matching, then you're talking about your ability to put away money, and then if you compound that, depending on your age and when you plan to retire, over time, it's far more than $50,000. It's so much money over time that
Yeah.
that's why it was like, I will kick myself. Like, I will kick myself if I don't do this. And, and I think that's also where there's power in numbers. Like, if people do this as a collective, I think, many years ago, I don't know that this is still happening, but there were spreadsheets that were created where people would anonymously and sometimes not anonymously talk about their comp. And that was really
Yeah.
helpful because now you've got a collective and it's really hard to fire a collective, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Um, yeah, and then there's so much for that. Of course, then if every year, if you're going to get a
Raise.
raise that's a percentage of your salary, it, your raise is lower if you're getting paid lower. So just everything,
And your
right?
bonus, if your bonus is a percentage, depending on how
Yep.
your bonuses are, sometimes they're flat, sometimes they're a percentage, and uh, that impacts it. Like at one of the companies I worked at, it was a percentage, and then depending on your performance rating, you could get above that percentage. So you're talking about tons of money that's just
Yeah.
um that's being left on the table.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Katica, there's so much more to talk about, but I feel like we're gonna have to sort of wrap it up. It's like you've brought so much wisdom and hard evidence to this conversation in such an amazing way. As a social scientist, but a qualitative one. I don't usually do research like that, but those numbers are just music to my ears because it can back up the stuff we're finding qualitatively and it can work in concert to really paint that picture. If people want to, read more of the things that you've written, obviously they could Google you, but is there a place they could go, a central place?
They can find me at Katica Roy, so KATICAROY, .com if they wanna reach out to me or read some of what I've written. The other way is on LinkedIn. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. Uh, so anyway, but yeah,
Beautiful.
you can Google me too.
Perfect. And final question, could you channel your inner teacher and give our listeners a homework assignment if they want one? If they're looking for something that one thing they could read or do or consider or watch, what might you assign them?
You know, so certainly they can read my MSNBC byline. I'm sure you'll put it in those show notes, and the New York Times and the Fortune articles. I would definitely, uh, those are great. And there's a video that also my data was for the New York Times that was used in that. I would definitely look at all that. And I can give you some of my television interviews. There's a couple. They're short, 3 to 5 minutes. It would be great.
Yep. Perfect. We'll find those links and we'll put them there so people can check it out. Um, Thank you so much. I know this has brought tremendous value and just been a really lovely conversation. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me to be on the podcast.
Right. Take care, Katica, and take care, everyone. Have a great week.